And there are so many, still, years later, still so many myths and misconceptions and rumors about what occurred in Bennington that day, which I'm talking about March the 20th of '03, that I thought that they should be addressed. For example, not too long ago, I was at a wake of a relative, of a neighbor of mine, and I was sitting there, and a gentleman that I had never met before came and sat down alongside me, and he said, "I know who you are. You're the lady who laid down in the middle of the Four Corners and backed up traffic from Albany to Brattleboro." And I thought, wow, years later, that myth still exists. And so one of the minor things I wanted the book to do was to dispel that, because the fact is, I've never, ever laid down in the middle of any street ever in my life. I would just never do that. But I knew something was planned, so I put on my jacket, came to the Four Corners about 11 o'clock that morning. A group had already gathered. I just stood at the back and watched. Because I'm so small, mostly I looked at other people's backs. But then eventually the group marched up Main Street and got maybe a little farther than this, and then turned around and went back to the Four Corners. Everyone was peaceful. I want to emphasize that. Everybody was peaceful. When we got back to the Four Corners, there were a lot of people there. The sidewalks were filled, the road was filled. So I just worked my way through the crowd and found a vacant spot in the middle of the Four Corners and just silently stood there holding my sign. There was a lot happening around me. There was street theater. People were in costumes. Horns were blaring. I just stood in silence holding my sign. I was thinking about what was happening in Iraq. And eventually I heard a voice behind me saying, "You have to get out of the road." And I said, "I'm sorry, I can't." And the voice said, "You have to get out of the road or I'm going to have to arrest you." I said, "I'm sorry, I can't." And the third time my peripheral vision told me it was an officer. The third time the officer told me I had to get out of the road, I said, "I'm sorry, I can't, and this is why." And I turned my sign around so that he could see the other side of it. One side had writing, the other side had some writing and some newspaper articles and a photograph of an Iraqi child that was bloodied that I actually cut out of the banner. And I'm very grateful that it was published here, and there should be more of that kind of truth. And pointed to the photograph of the child, and I said, "I'm sorry, I can't, and this is why." So the officer said, "Well, I have to arrest you." He was very kind and very sweet, and this doesn't appear in the book, but I felt sorry for him. I really did. You know, I could just tell this poor guy probably felt like, oh, it feels like I'm arresting my grandmother. But he was very nice and very kind, and he arrested me. I walked with him to the police cruiser, and we stood there, and there's noise and chaos and police dogs and state troopers and you name it, everybody in the sheriff's department. I mean, have you ever seen the movie Dog Day Afternoon? Well, this was more extreme than the scene outside the bank in Dog Day Afternoon. There were a lot more people here. The trial, I was found guilty.
Guilty of what?
That's really interesting, because the charge for each of us, all of us, were charged with the same thing, which was disorderly conduct with intent. And it's interesting because each one of us did something different, but that was the charge. And in my case, it was really interesting and I think ironic, because disorderly conduct brings up pictures of disorderly conduct. And the moments of my protest and when I was arrested were really the most solemn of my life. When I was standing at the Four Corners, I was solemn, I was silent, prayerful, and my thoughts were all about the Iraqi children. And the sign and what I said to the officer as he arrested me was absolute proof of what my intent was. So that was one of the bases for the appeal. Also, actually, we had a videotape of what took place at the Four Corners that day during the protest, and the judge did not allow the jury to see that either. I don't know if any of this would have made a difference in their verdict. The jury was only out like 8 minutes. But anyway, then came the appeal before the Supreme Court, and then many months later, the Supreme Court laid down its ruling.
And that ruling was what?
That my conviction was overturned. And that made big news, and I forget who it was. I forget whether it was a Banner reporter or a Rutland Herald reporter, but shortly after that there was a knock on my door,